The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
Good morning and welcome to this public meeting of the Subcommittee on the Protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland. We're holding today the 10th evidence session of our inquiry into the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, ahead of the continuation of committee stage deliberations on the bill on the floor of the House this afternoon. This inquiry follows the publication of our follow-up report into the economic and political impact of the Protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland in July. And we're joined today by Sir Julian King, former EU Commissioner and board member of Cooperation Ireland, and Peter Sheridan, Chief Executive Officer of Cooperation Ireland. Both our witnesses are joining us today remotely. You're both very welcome and we very much look forward to your evidence. Perhaps I could ask you to introduce yourselves briefly the first time you speak, not for our information, but for the information of our listeners. Today's meeting is being broadcast and a verbatim transcript will be taken for subsequent publication. And we'll send that to you to check for accuracy what you have told us in your evidence today. I should also refer to the list of members' interests as published on the committee's website. As for timing, we'll aim to draw the evidence session to a close about noon today, but that may partly depend on how gripped we are by what you are about to tell us. But welcome again, and perhaps I could just ask the first question to get us going, and that is just how would you characterise the political, economic, and social impact of the protocol as it is currently operating on Northern Ireland? And perhaps I could ask Julian.
Sorry, Chair, I think that was me moving my papers.
Well, perhaps I could ask, once that little interruption is over, perhaps I could ask Julian King to speak first, and then perhaps Peter Sheridan. Julian.
Good morning, Julian King, to those of you who I've not had the opportunity to meet in person before. I'm very glad to be with you, albeit virtually. The current situation is clearly very unsatisfactory. It has added to division, we might even say polarisation, between the communities in Northern Ireland, between the Unionist community in particular and the government of the Republic of Ireland, and it conditions and chills the relationship between the UK, HMG, and our neighbours in the EU, and indeed more widely, for example, with the US. The lack of an executive and an assembly has various negative consequences, which we might go on to. The possibility of elections is, in many people's views, likely to harden positions and not necessarily facilitate finding a way forward. Some of the potential positives of the situation, for example, economically, you do have the situation that businesses in Northern Ireland uniquely have unrestricted access to both the UK market and the EU single market, which should act as a big incentive for investment. Some of those potential positives are themselves being, I think, undermined by the political uncertainty. But I just wanted to say very briefly that, of course, we have to remember how we got here. I mean, after 2016, the EU, led by the Commission, I was there then, but backed by the member states, reached really quite quickly the view that if you were going to avoid a border on the island of Ireland, then the whole of the island needed to be within the single market, which meant that single market rules needed to apply in Northern Ireland. A number of us at the time said that was going to be difficult. It was going to raise issues. It needed to be done in a way that was sensitive to the particular history, the particular situation in Northern Ireland. And there was some recognition of that, I think, from the outset. For example, the Commission and the member states, the EU member states, agreed that the rules should be applied and upheld by the UK authorities, Northern Ireland authorities. That's completely unique. They do not anywhere else in the world delegate the implementation of EU rules to third country authorities. But their legal position was very firm, reflecting the nature of the EU as a legal community. And then, of course, those arrangements were agreed with the UK, with HMG. And so that, of course, now engages the EU's position on agreements, including international agreements. They have dozens of such agreements with countries all over the world. And so I think it's important that we remember that context as we review the conditions that we have at the moment in the current situation, which is so unsatisfactory.
Thank you very much for that start, Julian. Peter Sheridan, perhaps over to you.
Chairman, so Peter Sheridan, I'm the Chief Executive for Cooperation Ireland, have been for the last 12 years. I suppose just to reflect on the board of Cooperation Ireland, which is a very mixed board from right across the communities, and on that board there are many individual perspectives and experiences. And so collectively, we don't have one view. We didn't have one view at the 2016 referendum, but rather the board are more motivated by trying to assist others to reach agreement and using their experiences to do that. We've had previous submissions, both in verbally and written, to the Commission, and most recently the last evidence session, where we drew attention to the importance of trust between both sides as an essential prerequisite to any sort of compromise that's currently needed. But to your question, Lord J, and if I break it down just the three parts: the political impact, the economic, and the societal. So, and the political impact, the unique nature of Northern Ireland politics means it only functions on the basis of a carefully constructed balance of power between the communities. And both sides and the communities have to give their consent to any major changes. And the lesson of Northern Ireland's history is that power is either shared between the two communities or imposed. And if it's imposed, then it's more likely to lead to instability and unrest. And undoubtedly, since the 2016 referendum and more recently the protocol, support for power sharing is draining away and leading to a threat, I think, to the very foundations of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And it's undoubtedly true that on one half of Northern Ireland's delicate political balance, they reject the protocol, even in its current half-administered form and during the grace periods. And as a result of that, the north-south architecture is not working, and the executive itself and the assembly are no longer in place. And with that, there's a risk that power sharing might not easily be resurrected again in the future. And there are also significant concerns, particularly in the unionist community, that Northern Ireland will have no say about rules and regulations made in Europe that in the future impact on Northern Ireland. So we do need power sharing back on a sounder footing if the agreement settlement is to survive in it. And of course, on a wider perspective, then UK relationships with Europe, with the Republic of Ireland and Washington, and that lack of trust is very evident in it. From a positive perspective, the protocol has, which everybody wanted, avoided the return of a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. But it has meant that the moving of the trade border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. There are also positives for some of the businesses with unrestricted access both to the EU market and the UK market for imports and exports. But because of the divisive nature of Northern Ireland politics, not everybody is willing to put their hand up and say publicly the protocol is working for them. From an economic perspective, I have to say that there's a profusion of statistics that either support the view that the protocol is working or that it is economically damaging. And it's very difficult for ordinary people to judge the accuracy of either of those claims. And unsurprisingly, people tend to quote statistics that support either their position of being pro or anti-protocol that position. And so it's very difficult for people to find what's the right answer in the middle of all of that. Undoubtedly, there are practical implications. I've spoken to businesses, for business who are adversely affected by the working of the protocol, the access paperwork, etc. in it. But other businesses affected by the protocol, there's little evidence of how it's impacting on the lives of everyday people. To most people, other than potential future political consequences, there's little visibility of the impact of the protocol at the minute. And that, of course, may be to do with the grace periods, or it may be that in fact it's masked by other cost of living crisis that's happening. And so it's not clear to see how impacting the protocol is on everyday life. On economic performance, there's evidence of considerable trade diversion, but equally there are suggestions that Northern Ireland's economic growth is better than the UK and that Northern Ireland's had an economic net benefit. And current uncertainty with the protocol is no doubt undermining confidence with other manufacturers who may have located here or considered locating in Northern Ireland. They don't know what the final outcome will be, so they're not prepared to make decisions until there's some more certainty around it. And of course, depending on the EU response to the enactment of the protocol bill, which could remove the right of Northern Ireland to enter the EU single market, that also could have material economic consequences in the medium to long term. Finally, Lord J, on the social impact, the current situation has added to division and polarisation between the communities and between the unionist community and the Republic of Ireland government, with that continued lack of support for the institutions. and the lack of the executive, Northern Ireland executive, and the possibility of a future election is likely to harden positions and not assist positions.
Thank you very much. Those are two very helpful introductions to our discussion today. Perhaps I could ask Baroness Alone to ask the next question.
Thank you, Lord Chair. Could I ask you what is your overall assessment of the government's approach in relation to the protocol, and what, if any, impact do you expect the appointment of Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister to have on that approach? And perhaps, Peter, would you like to start?
Yeah, well, I suppose from the UK government's point of view, if the protocol is to work, it has to respect the needs of all of the people in Northern Ireland and respect the fact that Northern Ireland is an integral part of the customs territory of the United Kingdom, and the need for whatever happens in it to bear as lightly as possible on the everyday life of people in Northern Ireland. But it is difficult to understand how the government argued on the one hand that the protocol was necessary to protect the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and now argues that the protocol bill is necessary to protect the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And I suspect that the recent disruptions in the Conservative Party has meant that there hasn't been the bandwidth in government for sustained political engagement with the EU on these issues. There are concerns about the long-term reputational damage to the UK with the unilateral breach of the international treaty. The government has acknowledged that it would breach the legal obligations, but are justifying it on the grounds of necessity. Although I'm not sure many agree that that high bar will be easily met in it. And to reach agreed solutions will need to repair trust and as a prerequisite to resolving those issues. The appointment of the Prime Minister, Baroness Lone, he made his first visit to Northern Ireland during the previous leadership hustings, but there's little detail on where his policies will be in Northern Ireland. There's no doubt the UK is deeply in debt, with a deficit that is viewed by the markets as on an unsustainable path. The mini budget and the subsequent reaction from the markets have undoubtedly made that situation significantly more challenging. And the new Prime Minister has set out as his priority economic stability and the need to restore fiscal credibility. And I suspect other policies will then follow from that. So given that emphasis on economic stability, it would seem likely that he will want to avoid the protocol dispute escalating into whatever would happen thereafter, whether it's a trade war or whatever response the EU would make in it. And I noted back in March 2022 that the Prime Minister said that uncertainty about the UK's final relationship with the EU had dampened business investment in periods since the referendum in 2016. But I suppose finally it's also clear that the government twin track approach of trying to rewrite the treaty through talks with the EU, but with a backup of unilaterally changing it if those talks don't work out, and I haven't seen the Prime Minister demur from that.
Thank you. Sir Julian?
Well, perhaps I could most usefully just pick up where Peter was finishing on this question of what impact does the arrival of Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister have on the way people see this process. I think the important thing to underline is that he doesn't have some of the baggage of his immediate predecessors, as seen from the EU side. I don't think it's a secret that Boris Johnson had something of a trust deficit in Brussels. Some might suggest going back some time to his role as a journalist in Brussels, but certainly through his the EU perception of his handling of the negotiations and the process around the withdrawal agreement, and to an extent the TCA. Those were problems if your objective is to reach solutions through managing a relationship that is difficult and needs to be based on trust. Liz Truss came in as Foreign Secretary and reached out. It was perceived by the EU side to be making an attempt to have a warmer relationship. But quite quickly that stopped. There haven't been negotiations from February until quite recently, sort of a long period when she was Foreign Secretary and during her time as Prime Minister. There weren't negotiations going on between HMG and the EU side. And rightly or wrongly, many on the EU side perceived that to be because Liz Truss concluded, while Foreign Secretary, that conducting the kind of negotiations that she started was going to be very difficult for her in terms of managing her relationships across the Conservative Party. So, rightly or wrongly, many on the EU side saw the person who was charged with leading the negotiations prioritising party management over progressing the relationship with the EU and resolving problems around the Northern Ireland Protocol. Now we have new personnel, including a new Prime Minister. He is seen, as Peter said, as economically realist, and a lot of people are assuming that therefore he would not want to add to the economic challenges by triggering any form of EU. A number of people have also noted that he appears to be very committed to the UK Union, with some of his first bits of outreach being to the Scottish and the Welsh First Ministers, and he and his team engaging on Northern Ireland as well. There are those in Brussels who note his long-standing support for Brexit in principle, and there is still this lurking suspicion that questions of party management will be a factor in how all of this is approached by HMG. We shall see in the days, weeks ahead. There are now some negotiations. We'll probably get on to talk about that in a little bit more detail. And I think that is helpful if we are going to find a way forward. The one thing I'll just say at this stage is that so far the HMG appear to have taken the position that they want negotiations to be treated as a whole. They have reacted negatively to some suggestions that have been made that perhaps negotiations could be in some way sequenced to deal with some issues before other issues. I think you can talk about this a little bit more. I can understand why that is a starting position, but I think it's going to get in the way potentially of making concrete progress.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Interesting point right at the very end there, too, which we'll perhaps come back to. Lord Hayne.
Thank you very much for joining us this morning. If I started with you, Julian, in your old role as a commissioner, if you were advising your colleagues, fellow commissioners, in terms of changes that the EU should make to, on the one hand, satisfy unionists' legitimate interests and concerns over this, but on the other hand, maybe be less rigid, given that you said the EU's a legal entity and it tends to see things in that context, understandably. What flexibilities could it show in terms of the operation of the single market beyond derogating to the UK authorities in the way that it has?
Good morning. The first thing I think I would say about the sort of EU approach on the protocol is that they do now, some might say belatedly, but nevertheless, recognise that adjustments need to be made to the structure and the application of the protocol. And I think it's fair to say I'm not inside the EU negotiating team, obviously, but I think it's fair to say that they recognise that they probably will need to go further in some respects than the package of what they called enhanced opportunities, which Maros Šefčovič brought forward last October, which you will recall had various measures, short-term measures around medicines, but various proposals on how SPS and customs might work, and also some proposals for enhanced Northern Ireland participation of authorities, Northern Ireland authorities and stakeholders in the governments and decision making. All of those, I think, are areas that need to be further explored through discussion and negotiation. And from the EU perspective, the introduction of the bill, and we may go on to this a little bit more, I guess, in further questions, has undoubtedly had a chilling effect on the overall relationship and has limited the scope for the EU to show flexibility in those discussions. Indeed, it's limiting the prospects for wider engagement between the EU and the UK in ways that I find frustrating and negative. Beyond cooperation on Ukraine sanctions, there are lots of other things that currently would be in the shared mutual interest of the UK and the EU to be working on. For example, around energy and energy security, which is not happening as much as it could because of the freeze in the wider relationship at the moment. So I do think that this, we'll discuss a little bit more, it is limiting the scope for the EU to explore flexibilities in the discussions that are going on. It's having wider negative consequences on the relationship, and it's leading some on the EU side to take what I think is an overly hard line on the bill, which is that they occasionally argue that the bill would need to be withdrawn before it would be possible to make progress on further flexibilities. In as far as I'm asked by my ex-colleagues referred to, I caution that is a very tough position to take. That there may be opportunity while the bill is being discussed over whatever period it is discussed, that we shouldn't ignore to try and make progress by camping on a very hard line that we won't at least explore in negotiations, various options, unless the bill is withdrawn.
Thank you. Could I just pick you up on your phrase adjustments? The EU could make adjustments. Would that include amendments to the protocol or more light touch implementation of its effect across the Irish Sea?
So the proposals that are on the table at the moment deal with the implementation. And there are, as you know, important areas still under discussion, especially around customs, SPS, and governance. I think that those issues need further discussion. I think there needs to be flexibility on both sides, but there is scope for some flexibility on what has been published on the EU side.
Could that include?
How you then capture the outcome of those discussions, I think, is something that would have to itself be discussed in the negotiations.
Would that include the operation of the European Court of Justice? I don't know if you've seen the ideas floated by a member of our committee, Lord Thomas of Gresford, where he talks about a kind of side part of the Court of Justice, which could include British judges in the event of some dispute. I mean, do you think the EU is up for that kind of thinking?
So that's undoubtedly one of the harder issues from an EU perspective, because as you yourself acknowledged, the EU is a community of law. And when it comes to EU law, the EU can only recognise one body as final adjudicator, and that is the ECJ. And that reality goes to the core of how the EU works. I think it's very difficult for them to depart from that. How that is applied in practice is something that is done in different ways in different contexts. As I'm sure you know, in the EEA and the EFTA arrangements, how that it's applied in practice is reflected in the agreements that the EU has reached with those countries. But at the core, if there's a question for the EU on how EU law is going to work, they will look to the ECJ. There are wider issues on governance, which we might come back to, I think, about the need, recognised by everybody, but also recognised and acknowledged by the Commission, to find ways to properly represent Northern Ireland's participation in decision-making and governance.
I think Lord Godson has just one question for you, Sir Julian, then we'll move on to Peter Sheridan.
It was just, I wanted actually for you to ask, you were going to follow up, my Lord Chair. You noticed that in the last stanza of Sir Julian's comments, there was something that had piqued your interest, and so that's why I wanted I was interested for you to ask it, because it had similarly, it was not for me to barge in at this stage. Or did you want to wait for later?
We'll wait for later.
Okay, understood. I'm sorry to confuse.
All right. Peter Sheridan.
Apologies.
Yeah, just building briefly on what Mr. Julian said. On the upside, the EU also are asking for their preferred outcome would be a negotiated settlement. Now, we know that the two sides are a long way apart in that, but the current EU proposals, which adjust the protocol to cover a wide range of areas, including the SBS, products and medicines, as well as stakeholder engagement, it does show some flexibility, but there is room for further flexibility, and I think in a negotiated settlement there would be further flexibilities, or there should be further flexibilities. The proposals, as I said, currently still constitute an increase in regulatory barriers from the current state of affairs, and so things like the UK-wide subsidy control or the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice of the European Union. As Julian said, that's probably one of the most difficult ones.
Lord Chair, if I'm allowed, just Julian, you left that tantalising remark about the EU recognise there is a democratic deficit. That wasn't your term, but could you just elaborate briefly on that? And then I've probably overstayed my welcome on this question.
Well, you asked about the ECJ, and that is often the subject that is brought to the fore when the question of governance is raised. But I just wanted to say that there are other aspects of governance which I think it's acknowledged need to be addressed, including acknowledged by the EU side. There is a lack of provision, as things stand, for an active Northern Ireland voice to be heard in the management of the protocol arrangements. And I think that it's very important that is addressed, not only for current issues, but also looking ahead to, if you imagine a settlement and an agreed way forward, how that would work in future. There are various management bodies and committees that are envisaged in the withdrawal agreement and indeed in the trade and cooperation agreement. There are some specific to Northern Ireland. I think you need to look at how those bodies, when they operate between the UK and the EU, are going to take adequate account of the Northern Ireland perspective. Take a step back. I felt through the negotiation of the withdrawal agreement and to an extent the TCA that the process suffered from an absence of an official Northern Ireland voice, if you like.
Yeah.
And the Northern Ireland executive, as we all know, wasn't in a position to make its position as an executive heard. There were contacts with individual parties. But I think that the result, and part of the reason we're in the situation we're in, reflects that absence of a shared Northern Ireland voice quality. And if we're going to find a way forward, I think that needs to be rectified.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful, and I think those are views also which this committee has expressed in the past, so we're very glad to hear those. Margaret Ritchie, Baroness Ritchie.
Thank you, Lord Chair. First of all, I'd like to register my interest as a member of the Board of Cooperation Ireland. And Peter and Julian, you're very welcome. My question is, what is your overall assessment of the political, economic and legal impact of the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill? And what are the most significant elements of the bill from your perspective? And if I could go to Peter first.
Thank you, Baroness Ritchie. So I suppose from dividing those into, again, the political impact, the economic impact and the legal impact, and then I'll come to the last bit, the legal justification in it. So there's no doubt that many in the unionist community will be supportive of the bill, simply as a way of restoring their position in the United Kingdom if that position can't be reached through negotiations with the EU. They also see it as a way of redressing that democratic deficit we were just speaking about, where they see that the community in Northern Ireland has no say in laws made in Europe, but which affect the community in Northern Ireland. But Julian did say earlier on that the bill has had a chilling effect on EU-UK relationships, not least because it could result in non-performance of certain UK obligations. And Northern Ireland could lose its right to enter the single market, and there would be material consequences flowing from that. The bill itself does depart from the Northern Ireland Protocol, but it also enables ministers to depart from the protocol even further, should they decide to do that. On the economic impact, it's difficult to see how the bill won't add to the uncertainty that's already there, and that it could add to further trade disruption, as companies would be, in some instances, unclear of their legal obligations, particularly if there are any contradictory provisions, as we are today in it. The passages of the protocol do provide benefit that the bill appears to leave untouched. So those parts of the protocol that they see are working, the bill does appear to leave those parts untouched in it. On the legal impact, well, clearly I'm not a legal expert, so it's a layperson's view, but I have watched much of the debates in the House of Lords and the House of Commons and kept abreast of the commentary. And I am aware that the government does acknowledge, as I said, that it does disapply international law, but they've given the justification, the grounds of necessity. But listening to the debate last week, it's very difficult to see how that defence can be invoked, particularly where the state was a party to the agreement. There is an agreement, but we'll have to see where that goes. On the significant elements of the bill, again, not a legal expert, but certainly, the breach of international obligations doesn't sit comfortably with me, and that it goes to the heart of the UK's reputation, and even in any agreements that the UK might reach currently with the EU, it wouldn't be unreasonable for the EU side to say, well, how do we know to stick to those? They didn't the last time round. And the bill does unilaterally depart from the Northern Ireland Protocol and gives ministers additional powers, and so as such represents a stark transfer of power from Parliament to the Executive. And as I read it, it seems the government giving significant powers to itself, not just to amend existing primary legislation, but also to amend the provisions of the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill itself.
If I could ask you a further question, Peter, and tease out this legal justification, or the government's legal justification. I accept that you're not coming from a legal training perspective, but from your assessment, what do you think of the assessment of the government's legal justification for the bill? Because you've referred to the powers that ministers or prospective ministers may have as a result of the implementation of this legislation.
Yeah, well, I listened intently in the debate on Tuesday last week in the House of Lords, and particularly those who came from a legal background, and it does seem that it is an extremely high bar or high test for the doctrine of necessity to be accepted. And I couldn't find many arguments to say or a demonstration of how it would reach that test, but that's only a layperson's view on it.
Thank you. On all of those questions, Sir Julian.
Well, I'm very conscious that your house is deep in the detail at this moment. And you're going through this in fine detail, including later on today. So I'm just going to take half a step back and say first, I agree with what Peter said. Secondly, there's quite a lot of feedback.
Can I pause for a moment? I don't know whether Peter Sheridan's got his mic on, but we got a bit of interruption there. Let's try again. Over to you, Julian.
Is that better?
Yes.
Yep.
Right. So you're deep into the detail. I agree with what Peter has just said.
Riveting stuff.
I want to take half a step back and just say that first and obviously, the fact that the bill is there is having this chilling effect and is certainly complicating not only addressing the issues that we're talking about today, but the wider relationship between HMG and the EU. I'm concerned that some on the EU side are taking an overly hard view on what is, after all, a parliamentary process, ongoing parliamentary process. And beyond a chilling effect, this might freeze discussions, because there are some who have argued that unless the bill is withdrawn, the EU should not make further attempts to find solutions through additional flexibilities and engage in that way in the discussions that are now back underway. And I think that would be a mistake. So I hope that one of our messages collectively is that if we're going to leave space and a certain amount of time to try and find an agreed way forward, then that requires all sides to engage in that process positively, HMG and the EU, and that might be possible during the continued examination of the bill. If the bill were to be passed, then I think we would have to be ready for the EU to react, because in those circumstances, they would be faced with a partner who had legislated to undo an international agreement. And that, from the EU's perspective, obviously goes to the heart of the relationship they have with HMG, but also, as I said at the outset, goes much wider. They have a whole network of agreements that they rely upon with dozens of countries around the world, and their core internal functioning relies upon the effective respect of agreements reached. So in those circumstances, I think you would have to expect that they would react. There are various precedents around, none of them very encouraging. In the past, when it's been perceived that agreements have been broken, the EU side have drawn up various trade sanctions. They are willing to do that, including with very important trade partners like the United States, where in the past they've drawn up long, extensive and targeted lists of trade sanctions in order to inflict some economic discomfort on the United States for what they perceive to be breaches of international agreements. So in those circumstances, I think, let's hope we don't get there, the impact of the bill, if enacted, would be very significant.
And the most significant elements of the bill for you, Sir Julian?
So I'm commenting consciously on the fact of the bill. If you go within the bill, I think that the EU, as Peter suggested, will view the powers that the bill gives ministers to further depart potentially from an agreed framework, compound their concerns about the approach of the bill.
Thank you. Lord Jay.
Thank you very much, Baroness Ritchie. Lord Dodds.
Thank you, Lord Chair, and hi, Peter and Julian. It's good to see you again. I'm always interested and intrigued with some experience of the European Parliament for a number of years myself as to the EU being concerned about the removal of powers from a legislature to an executive. I think it's a concept that they're quite used to, but in Northern Ireland we have seen when people complain about Henry VIII clauses and the removal of powers to the executive, we've seen the removal of powers and law-making decisions not just from any legislator but from any government minister to Brussels, which is quite a unique situation. It goes far beyond the concerns about Henry VIII clauses. But on the bill itself, does it represent a means to address issues? You mentioned the October EU proposals, which deal with 4 areas, but the bill goes much further in dealing with democratic deficit issues, state aid issues, VAT issues, which aren't addressed at all in the EU October proposals. So how else are these issues addressed if the EU isn't willing to negotiate them in order to put right things that are required by many people in Northern Ireland? Julian, if you start off on that one, please, and then go to Peter.
Well, certainly. And I hope it follows from what I've said already that I agree with you that these questions of democratic accountability are very important. And I would say essential if you're going to find a viable long-term way forward. I referred earlier, and the chair picked it up, that I understand why in a negotiation you try and take an overall approach, and indeed the EU very often takes the position that things have to be considered as a whole. Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. But there are different sorts of issues here, and I do think that we would need to think creatively about whether there is some kind of staged approach that might work in these circumstances, whereby as you are trying to rebuild, let's face it, damaged trust and confidence, probably on both sides, you need to think about whether there are some confidence-building measures, if I can use that kind of language, that you can start to try and agree on in order to open up the possibility of addressing other more difficult issues, more difficult for either side. And so if you were in that mindset, we can talk a little bit more about the detail if that's useful. I think there are things that you could look at around the kind of issues that have already been put on the table, including the October package, that if you are making progress on those, might then allow you to have further discussions on other issues that at the moment are not on the table, whether those be issues around VAT and subsidies, or indeed the difficult issues around governance. And I do think, personally, that is a more hopeful way of trying to explore these difficult issues than one side legislating in a way that the other side would be bound to respond to in ways, I think, which would make the situation for the UK as a whole and Northern Ireland as well more difficult.
Thank you. Just to pick up on that, but I accept what you're saying about stage negotiations. I understand what you're saying. But some of the issues that I've referred to that are in the bill require changes to the protocol itself. So are you saying that you think that the EU may well be willing, if progress is being made on some implementation measures in some areas, that they would open up the protocol in relation to dealing with things like state aid and VAT, for instance?
Well, I no longer speak on behalf of the EU.
Just looking for your insight.
I'm not in the engine room of their negotiating team. But what I am fairly clear about is that whether or not that's going to work, it's certainly got a better chance of working than the legislative route, because the EU will be bound to respond in the way that we've already touched upon, which will make it much harder to make progress. So I'm not, on their behalf, promising that these issues would come onto the table, but I can see that there's a chance which is much higher than if there's a standoff. And as I think I said earlier, one of the things that would need to be discussed is how any agreements reached would then need to be encapsulated. And that's obviously one of the things that would have to be discussed.
And if you forgive me, Lord Chair, just a final question to Julian, since he is so well placed and knows Brussels so well and his experience of the Northern Ireland scene as well. Before I come to Peter, is there a sense from the people you talk to in Brussels, in and around the Commission and so on, Julian, that they're waiting for Starmer? That really, they see what's going on at Westminster. Why give an awful lot? Let's see this period out. Let's see what happens at the next election. It's a well-known approach by the EU. They can sit things out a long time. I've heard that said by people I know in Brussels that really they're waiting for a change of government.
Well, I've heard that said as well, and indeed you can read it in the press. What is clear is that they had very limited expectations around the Johnson administration. They felt some frustration with the lack of contact after February with Truss, and that they note that there are a new team in place, not just the Prime Minister. They also know that the current situation, for all the reasons we discussed right at the start of this session, is deeply unsatisfactory for everybody involved, including the EU. So, as it were, sitting on your hands and waiting is not a cost-free option.
Thank you, Julian. And Peter, just on the bill, I mean, you have already touched on some of those issues already, so...
Just very briefly, then, I mean, the fact that the government's clear preference is for a negotiated solution with the EU suggests that there's a better way to resolve it than the bill. But let's take it that the bill happens. And I suppose the bill deals with a lot of the lack of consent for the protocol that's in one community in Northern Ireland. But I suppose the opposite of that, if the bill were to pass in that way, that lack of consent may well be replaced by a wider lack of consent on any alternative unilateral action that's taken in it. So if, for example, the bill were to lead to a serious confrontation with the EU, then it's unlikely that issues will have been resolved. The bill will have resolved the issues. because it could lead to that further damage to the Northern Ireland economy. And of course, we don't know what action the EU will take in it. I suppose that you could replace one lack of consent with another lack of consent if the bill goes through as it is.
But like the protocol itself, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly.
Lord Chair, thank you.
Thank you very much, Lord Dodds. Baroness Gowdy.
Good morning. Nice to see you again, Peter and Sir Julian. I'd like to ask you about the government's arguments in the bill. Is it necessary to say that it's necessary to safeguard the Belfast Good Friday Agreement? And does the protocol engage in the agreement's provision on cross-community consent, and also what impact the protocol had and what impact will the bill have on the three strands of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement? I've put all that in one so that you can take which parts, as you've both answered us different parts of this previously, so it's for you to start. Peter, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, well, I suppose at the outset, Baroness Gowdy said that the government said that the protocol was necessary to safeguard the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and now it's that the protocol bill is necessary to safeguard the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. So there's certainly a contradiction in that. But to be fair to the government, I suppose that it's reacting to a lack of support, particularly in the unionist community, for the protocol. It's also reacting to a lack of support among some Conservative MPs and among some in the business community about the protocol and the material consequences that it has for power sharing and the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and Northern Ireland's position within the Union. So there has to be some recognition that that's why the government are engaged in it. And on the future regulatory differences between Northern Ireland and the rest of the EU, that can grow, or the UK, that could grow over time. And should regulations in the rest of the UK diverge further from those, then the EU, from the EU, then the unionist view that would be that Northern Ireland would become further separate and distinct from the rest of the United Kingdom. And so from the unionist perspective, the view is that the EU has made little or no attempt to deal with their significant concerns that the protocol raises for their future as part of the United Kingdom. On the cross-community consent, the Belfast Agreement was based on the principle of consent, and in particular cross-community consent. And that, like, vital importance of consent was recognised in the provision for alignment in the protocol for it to be disapplied if Northern Ireland's political representatives concluded was no longer viable or desirable after 4 years. So embedding that recognition of consent in the protocol is built into its acceptance by the UK government. But for the protocol to work, it must respect the needs of all Northern Ireland's people, respect the fact that Northern Ireland is an integral part of the customs territory of the United Kingdom. That's under Article 4 of the protocol, and respect the need to have as little impact as possible on the everyday life of people in Northern Ireland. But the consent mechanism which the Johnson government secured with the withdrawal deal, when the withdrawal deal was reached, did not introduce a requirement for cross-community consent. And I suppose that they viewed that it would be wrong for one or other of the larger communities in Northern Ireland to have a veto over a treaty between the UK and the EU. But nevertheless, there are two different styles of consent in it. But there's no doubt from Cooperation Ireland's perspective that the cross-community consent is highly desirable and would ensure or secure greater stability for the post-Brexit arrangements if it was there. On your question on the impact of the protocol on the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, the political situation in Northern Ireland and the position taken, I suppose, by the DUP vis-a-vis not entering the executive is evidence of damage being done to the 1998 Good Friday Belfast Agreement by the protocol and the result of to some extent, the 2016 referendum. And as a consequence, Northern Ireland has no properly functioning executive or assembly. And we may well be facing an election, and the north-south dimensions aren't operating and currently not working. So they are all outworkings of where we are currently. But as I said to Lord Dodds, the difficulty in this for everybody is that the lack of consent for the protocol on the side of one part of the community could easily be replaced by a lack of wider consent for any unilateral alternative in it.
Thank you very much, Peter. So, Julian.
Well, I echo and agree with what Peter has just set out. I remember the arguments around consent, and I think it was important that the EU recognised at the time that building consent in to the process was reflecting the need to take account of Northern Ireland voices. It was the Johnson government that chose the form of consent that is now in the withdrawal agreement. They didn't at that stage introduce a requirement for cross-community consent. I think we can all see that if we're going to find a way forward that is sustainable, a greater degree of cross-community consent is going to have to be built somehow. And again, talking to people in Brussels, the EU recognises that as well. And I guess that will be one of the elements of discussion if we get that far on constructive ideas for future governance. But I would also echo what Peter has said, and I think this is very important perspective. It really does seem to me very difficult to see how passing the bill can help the situation. I can't see how it's going to assist North-South, East-West particularly, or indeed the internal relations within Northern Ireland, and it certainly won't facilitate continued discussions between Northern Ireland, HMG and the EU about how to manage this situation into the future.
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed. Chairman?
Thank you, Baroness Gowdy. Lord Godson.
Thank you, my Lord Chair. Thank you, Sir Julian. Thank you, Mr. Sheridan. And thank you again for your noting the deliberations of this House at second reading and committee stage on the Northern Ireland Protocol bill. It's really just following. I was interested listening, obviously, to those debates in the House in the last fortnight. And just particularly, obviously, because, of course, as you rightly point out, many critical things were said about that legislation by lawyers, non-lawyers, and all of the others, is if it's such a disaster, why are negotiations still going on at all? Why indeed is there sign of some promise in the negotiations, including, of course, pragmatism from the Southern Irish government, which has been appreciable. So I just would be keen to just get a sense, particularly obviously from, in this case, from Sir Julian as a former commissioner and also obviously a former ambassador to the Irish Republic, as to why any progress is being made at all. Secondly, also to Sir Julian, again in those capacities, just interested in any, because you made one or two historical allusions to events that had gone on obviously since 2016, is just your views of lessons learned perhaps of over-negotiation. And whilst, again, most of the criticism has been of the UK government, it was, I'm sure you knew Rory Montgomery well as a senior Department of Foreign Affairs official in the Irish Republic, and his remarks about the utter obliteration of the UK government's position in the negotiation there, and the implicit criticism of the Irish Republic stance of over-negotiating and leading to the subsequent imbalance that's been noted. Finally, for Mr. Sheridan, just interested, there was a bit of a controversy a few years ago, the reports in the Irish Independent, remarks of a special advisor to the then Taoiseach about the instability on the island of Ireland and the potential of dissident Republican violence in consequence of matters, controversy around the protocol and the post-Brexit situation on the island of Ireland. Just interested in your latest thoughts on the potential, Mr. Chairman, in the light of your previous career, although you're a few years out, obviously, from that, on threats on the island of Ireland, because, again, the totality of that distant threat, as appeared to be foreshadowed in those Irish Independent reports, haven't sort of the worst fears have not so far materialised. I'd be grateful for all of you to your collective opinions on any one and all of those queries.
So Julian, go first, perhaps.
Well, thank you. Why are the discussions going on? Because both sides, I think, live in hope that those discussions might produce a productive way forward. There was a long gap between February this year and last month, during which there weren't discussions. So it's not inevitable that discussions go ahead. In last month, there were, as I understand it, sort of 3 weeks of discussions. I think there's contacts continuing subsequently, which looked at customs and data, SPS, and some of the questions around governance, including this question of democratic accountability. I've seen various comments from the UK side noting that those discussions have restarted and sounding quite hopeful about the fact of discussions. I have to say that talking to ex-colleagues in Brussels on the EU side, they would have a slightly cooler view of those re-engaged discussions. One person said to me that there was nothing new in those discussions and that they had made no difference. So I hope that if and as those contacts continue, we can move beyond that. Because the alternative to trying to make progress in some kind of staged and managed way through discussions is the legislative standoff that we've been discussing in answer to the last few questions, which doesn't seem to me to help the situation and is actually going to almost certainly make it worse. On questions of sort of lessons learned, I think the main lesson that I drew from, I wasn't actively engaged in the negotiations. I was in the Commission doing a job on security, but we received reports of the negotiations. And one of the reflections I had, which I actually shared with I agreed at the same time with my Irish colleague in the Commission then, Phil Hogan, was that the absence of an Northern Ireland executive voice in that period in the negotiation process was significant and led to some of the suboptimal outcomes that we're now having to deal with. Because although the Commission sought to engage with individual parties, it didn't, through that engagement, get any kind of shared messaging or shared position, and it didn't have an official executive position that it would have, I think, felt it had to take more account of. And we can't rerun history. We have to deal with that. You talk about the Irish negotiating position. The Irish government undoubtedly negotiated hard, which was entirely legitimate for them to do, to seek to preserve and protect their interests as they perceive them. But I also know that there was a structural issue there as well. And the structural issue there was that Ireland remain an EU member state. So the EU, when negotiating, was bound to take account of the position of one of the member states. Even if the Irish diplomats had been slightly less good at negotiating than they proved to be, that would have still been the structural situation.
Just curiosity, do you think also as a former, obviously UK diplomat, that we negotiated hard enough on our side? Of course, one would expect the Irish Republic to stand up for its representatives, stand up for its own interests. Did the UK government stand up hard enough for the UK from your vantage point, having been dual-hatted both as a UK rep and obviously as a commissioner?
Well, again, during this period, I was working for the EU, not for the UK, and I was doing a job on security, not the negotiations. So I was at a remove from the negotiating process. But the people who were involved in the negotiating process from the UK side were very seasoned and experienced, and I'm sure they did their job to the very best of their abilities and with great professionalism. But the situation that we are dealing with now, as I said at the outset, was agreed by the Johnson government. That is a fact that is one of the conditions that we have to deal with.
Mr. Sheridan.
Lord Godson, so on the security end of it, first of all, I find no appetite for violence in any community around this. And in fact, I was with a number of people who would be very close to the loyalist community yesterday, and we had this very discussion, and they were saying the same things. And we have a habit in this place, Lord Godson, of moving very quickly from people who vehemently disagree with some political situation to even disorder or street unrest to then to a full-blown terrorist campaign. And I can assure you it's not that easy moved along that continuum to get access to weapons and explosives that would see a violent campaign resurrected on any side very quickly. And I have absolutely no doubt that both the police, the guards, security services will be very alert to all that currently in it. But in the community, whilst there's a lot of disagreement, a lot of, and I mean vehement disagreement about this, but I don't detect among the vast majority of people any move to bring violence to bear on this. There were some commentaries in the paper at the weekend that there were within hours of some event happening at a government building in the Republic of Ireland because of the conversations that started around joint authority. But then that was stopped very quickly. How accurate that is, I don't know. In that, I mean, clearly when Minister Coveney was up, there was a bomb hoax up at the Hubin Centre in Belfast when he was there. But the police have responded, and there will be people who appear before the courts on that in it. You referred to an article in the Irish Independent. Was it the Irish Times article?
No, it was in the. I do remember it was in the Independent. Actually, it would have been a few years ago. As I say, one of the special advisors in the then Irish government was quoted. It caused some interest on both sides of the Irish Sea.
I mean, maybe my recollection may be wrong in this, but I remember
it may have been covered in the Irish Times as well. But I think it was originally in the Independent.
Yeah. So what my my memory from all of that was that this is before the withdrawal agreement was signed, and it hadn't been decided where the trade border was going to go, and there were still discussions that had been on the land border and how difficult that would be if it was on the land border. And the reflections were that even during the security situation, none of us ever viewed that we'd moving from when there were customs posts along the border that were attacked, that the police then had to go in and guard customs officers along the border, and when the police were attacked along the border or communities were attacked along the border, then the army came in to support the police, and when the army were attacked along the border, they ended up having to build fortifications on the border. Nobody ever set out with that plan in mind. So I think the question at the time was that if we turbocharge smuggling because we can't get agreement on free trade across the border, then both the guards and the police will have to respond, and the reality is that the response would be along the border, and then what would the implications for that be? As I recall, that's what the article was about. In other words, you moved from what was a simple customs border in the 70s to something in the 90s where we had 12 army watchtowers and within 10 miles of South Armagh. We had 40 odd roads sealed off and 6 permanent checkpoints on roads, and nobody ever set off at that intention of that being the architecture, but that's how things then rolled out as attacks happened on it.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Lord MP. Right.
Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you for your attendance. We have covered the first part of my question through discussion already, I think, but could we come to the nitty-gritty here of a resolution, where do you see this of the landing zone being for a solution between the two sides? Answers on a postcard, please. So, Julian.
Well, consistent with what I've said already, I think the chances of finding a sustainable basis for the future is markedly higher if we manage to do it through some kind of negotiated process with shared investment than if we resort to standoff of the UK on one side and the EU on the other. And if you were pursuing that track, then I think that there is a strong case for finding some way of doing it, if not in a staged approach, then at least starting with some confidence-building measures and seeing whether those could pave the way to other more difficult issues. And I think there is some scope there. There have been problems over steel that I know the committee is familiar with. The EU could make a move there around a specific quota for steel going from GB to Northern Ireland, and I think that would address that issue. There's been some progress already on medicines. There are issues around medicines and medical devices, actually, that affect the whole of the UK, which need to be pinned down. The EU infraction proceedings, the legal proceedings, 2 waves of which have been started or restarted, could be slowed or frozen. Which would, I think, help build confidence as well. Then you get on to more difficult, but still perhaps not the most difficult issues around customs, SPS and veterinary. There, I think that it's not an easy measure, and I don't think it would come early in discussions, but some recognition at some point, again requiring movement on the EU side, to acknowledge that the existing grace periods on a number of these issues it's quite difficult to see those being unwound. So how do you capture the reality of the existing grace periods in a way that is acceptable to both sides? On veterinary issues, there are a number of international precedents, much discussed, that could be adopted. That would require, I think, some movement on HMG's part, because at the moment they have not signalled interest in any of the main internationally available precedents. On customs, you have proposals from the UK side around some kind of green lane. You have proposals from the EU side around some kind of express lane with simplified procedures around customs and indeed SPS. So the question there is, can you find some accommodation that spans the difference between simplified procedures and no procedures at all? It would be technically complicated, technically complex, but then the customs area is inherently quite complicated, which might give you scope or manage to rebalance things that reflect a less precautionary approach to the risk of goods going on into wider circulation in the single market. And that would benefit from improved data exchange. Again, something where HMG would need to make data available in a form that could be used by EU authorities to offer reassurance internally and to any EU member state capital who raised issues. And I think that is not inconceivable. So if you were able to imagine you were able to make some progress along those lines, then other issues, Lord Stodds referred to some of them earlier, might come onto the table. I'm not underestimating at all the difficulty of making progress on those issues, but at least you would have created some momentum. I don't know whether that's helpful.
Yes, it is. Thank you very much, Julian. Peter, you've got your plan sitting there, so share it with us.
Well, but I suppose on the upside, the language has certainly changed over this last while, and if both the EU and the UK are saying they want to find agreed solutions, well, then that's a good place to be. And clearly, it's neither in the UK or the EU's interest to allow matters to escalate further. It's a lose-lose for both. And arguing who loses most is a zero-sum game in it. So what changes what would change the circumstances, allow agreed solutions to be more preferable? Maybe there's to improve those chances that the UK government could consider pausing the passage of the bill. I didn't say withdrawn, say pausing it. And the EU could consider either, as Julian says, pausing those infringement proceedings or conceding that much of the GB&I trade, for example, moving to supermarkets, doesn't pose a risk to the single market. And therefore the ground rules would change in that, and maybe the atmosphere changes. Sir Jonathan Stevens, former Permanent Secretary in the NIO, also made an interesting comment recently where he talked about that a lot of what's happened in the protocols tended to focus on the desired outcomes, and less attention had been paid to the process to get to those outcomes. And whilst he agreed that the process was as important, if not more so, than the outcome. So finding ways that a process which engages the key stakeholders enables them to take ownership. That's what happened in the Good Friday Agreement. All of the parties were involved, including, if you remember at the time, people who were affiliated with paramilitary organisations, allowed them to take ownership of it rather than feeling it's imposed on them from the outside. And I suspect that to a lot of people in Northern Ireland, they feel that it's being imposed. So finding a way that the parties could become involved might be helpful in that.
Thank you, Peter. Can I just have a supplementary to you both? Is it fair to say, Sir Julian, that what you're saying is that we're looking here at adjustments to the implementation of the protocol to make it less invasive, but we're not looking at currently changes to the protocol itself? I'm making that distinction.
So, as I think we touched on a little bit earlier, the existing parameters of the negotiation on the EU side are as you described them. Any chance of changing those, I think, would be dependent on the progress of the negotiation, and any changes that you reached that, for example, on VAT or subsidies, one of the elements that you would have to discuss is how any agreed changes would be reflected in the legislation and legal framework.
Peter, would you agree with that?
Well, I mean, the position of the EU is as you know, is that it's the implementation. But who knows what would happen if the atmosphere changes and movement starts to happen and we start to get agreed solutions. That opens up, I think, all sorts of possibilities from people's fixed positions currently.
And what happens if our House significantly amends the bill to the point that it becomes toothless?
Well,
Sir Julian.
So, again, as we were touching upon earlier, the handling of the bill, the passage of the bill, is being very closely watched on the EU side, and it certainly conditions the willingness to engage in anything like the process that I and Peter were just describing. So I'm sure your House will have that in mind as you consider what treatment you give the bill as it goes forward. But again, I think we all collectively need to send a message that if you're going to have positive engagement and a degree of flexibility through that engagement, then it's a mistake to have too thick red lines. And that applies on the UK side to certain aspects of the bill. And I think it applies on the EU side to anybody who said, well, we're not going to engage until the bill is withdrawn.
Peter.
Yeah, well, that's why I think I was referring to if the bill was paused and that then, there was reciprocal agreements from the EU that would change the atmosphere in it. So you wouldn't get to that stage where the bill becomes toothless. And if the bill becomes toothless, I suppose we're back into, and we can't get agreed solutions, we're back in the same place as we are now. And a large part of the community in Northern Ireland feels that its identity is being lost in the middle of that.
Thank you, Lord Chairman.
Thank you very much. And Lord Dodds had a question, I think.
Sorry to come in again, Lord Chair, but just Julian, you said earlier, I think, I just wanted to clarify, did you say earlier that you'd picked up that from some of your EU friends that there was nothing new that the UK government were bringing to the table as things stood at the moment? Did I pick you up right in saying that? You referenced something about nothing new from the British side?
So I was reporting a comment from one person on the EU side following the short period of recent discussions. Yes. I don't know that reflects a wider view, and I don't know that would reflect, as it were, a considered view of the overall position of the new government.
I think in the absence of any explanation from anyone about where talks are at, it's hard to guess where things stand, but thank you for clarifying that. Appreciate it.
Baroness Ritchie.
A quick follow-up on that, Lord Chair. Obviously, I have listened intently to what Sir Julian has said about the issue around negotiations. Maybe it's time for political negotiations to begin now that we have seemed to have some settlement around the appointment of the Prime Minister, and I was wondering if Sir Julian had any view on that.
These negotiations, if they're going to progress, will be inherently technically complicated, but agreement is not likely to be built from the technical level up.
Political level.
Agreement will be framed politically.
Just one final question to me on time scales, Sir Julian. I mean, you've talks are going now, although, as you said, there's rather a different opinion from the Commission and from the British government about how much progress they're making. You've talked about confidence-building measures being introduced at some stage into the negotiations. What in your view would be the likely timescale of negotiations from now on? And to where do they take us in the firmament of Northern Ireland events?
So again, I'm not in the engine room of the negotiations, so it's an opinion based on second and third hand accounts and should be treated accordingly. But it does seem inherently quite difficult to reach a deal on some of the more complicated subjects in the next few weeks. So that has a bearing on, I guess, the point of your question, on the question of whether there's going to be a substantive deal in time for the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland not to call an election.
And just going one stage further from that, a number of us were in Belfast recently, and it was put to us that that the prospect of a visit from President Biden was a relevant factor in this context. Do you see that as a relevant factor? Is that a sort of a point which might cause people to think, well, we better get this done sooner rather than later, or at least by next April?
So what I do think is the case is that the US administration, we've got a lot of other things on their plate, obviously, but the US administration from the highest level in the White House and actively in the White House staff do follow this process very closely and do engage and do make a point of actively engaging and making their engagement known, both in the UK and in Brussels. And so people on both the EU side and the UK side, I think, will be in no doubt about what this administration thinks.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It's been extremely helpful, and thank you very much to both of you. That really has helped our inquiry a lot. And I'm going to cause the formal session of the to end in a moment. Perhaps you could just stay on for 1 second. But let me just say now that I bring the formal proceedings of the committee to a close.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.